Okay, everybody, so we're heading into our final section on Chapter 13. There's going to be an additional video and some activities around your questionable claims paper that you can check out as well, but this is the last of our content about the Chapter 13. So we're going to talk just a little bit more about how we measure personality, and along the way we're also going to talk about trait theory. All right, so first of all, just a disclaimer, I'm a trait theorist. I was educated by people who were big proponents of the Big Five measurement of personality as I was trained in graduate school. So I have some opinions, and you're going to hear them when it comes to how we measure personality. And that's shaped by my education and my perspective. So trait theories. A trait would be a stable characteristic that makes up human personality. There's a variety of traits. We're going to talk about some of them in this particular unit. But you can think of a trait as a consistent, enduring way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. Surface traits are traits that are easily observed, and source traits are at the core of our personality. I'm going to go through a particular scale that was developed, which I've already alluded to, the Big Five, that consists of 5 source traits. The goal of trait theory is to predict behavior by measuring traits and seeing how well they can help us understand how someone will behave. It's important to understand that personality is not the sole prediction of behavior. There's many other things that contribute to how we behave and why we behave. And I would say that personality is consistently a very modest predictor of behavior. And there is some research to suggest that it tends to predict behavior under very specific circumstances. When the circumstances change, sometimes that prediction ability is not as robust. You can also think of singular traits versus holistic description of self. So for example, you can measure an individual trait like locus of control or like narcissism as a personality trait independently, or you can have a cluster of traits that tend to paint a holistic picture of the entire self. And we will talk a little bit more about the Big Five as a holistic measure to describe the different facets of self in a holistic, whole person sort of way. That's Sansa saying hello. She's been sitting on my lap for most of this session, which is lovely. Let's talk about how we measure personality. So one of the best ways to measure personality is through behavioral assessments, through directly observing someone's behavior. So for example, if you want to determine if someone is outgoing, look at their behavior at a party. If you want to determine if someone is conscientious, take a look at the state of their sock drawer. You can also take a look at someone's gait, which is how they walk, their expressiveness, as well. So for example, how much does someone move their face and move their hands? Does somebody walk with an open sort of shoulders back approach, or are they kind of hunched over a little bit, and do they scuttle around a little? This is where I usually like to say in class that behavioral assessments are not necessarily always accurate. So for example, if you might remember, I can be kind of expressive. I move my face a lot, I move my hands a lot. I tend to overemphasize things sometimes. And the reason why is not because I'm incredibly outgoing. Oh no, it's because I was raised by actors. So I've learned to be very expressive in the ways that I communicate with other people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm extroverted. Far from. Sometimes you can give people a structured or unstructured interview in order to determine their personality. So there's various interview models out there and scripts out there that you can follow in order to determine someone's personality. There's also personality inventories. We're going to get into some details about different types of personality inventories on later slides, but that would be a paper pencil measure. And then there's projective tests. Projective tests are where you're shown a picture that is ambiguous and asked to interpret it. So a Rorschach inkblot test would be an example of a projective test, as would a thematic apperception test. So I'm going to show you some examples of projective tests, and then we're going to loop back around to personality inventories. So on the left there is an example of the Rorschach blot, the classic Rorschach. I have yet to watch the new Watchmen series, but I am excited about it. Those of you who are Watchmen fans will recognize Rorschach. And on the right is an example of the thematic apperception test. So you might be shown this picture that's ambiguous and then asked to interpret it. Is the man smiling, or is he grimacing and in pain? Is he climbing? Is he falling? Is he struggling? The sorts of words that people use might indicate a little bit about where they tend to come from and how they tend to approach the world. Of course, one of the challenges with these more ambiguous tests is that their interpretation can be also a little up in the air. Consistency can be challenging to achieve across different scorers, and interpretation can vary a bit too much sometimes. I tend to be a little skeptical of these types of tests. Speaking of skepticism, let's talk about the Myers-Briggs. Once again, I'm going to have some opinions in this particular section because of my background. So Myers-Briggs is a set of tests based on Jungian theory. Now, we haven't talked a lot about Carl Jung. For the sake of time, I was kind of honing in my focus on Freud. Carl Jung was a neo-Freudian who was a student of Freud's, who developed a few interesting theories, including the collective unconscious, which is a very interesting sort of philosophical idea about how we're all connected and have things in common that link us together primally. That's, once again, an interesting philosophy. It's not really something that you could study scientifically, so I don't tend to spend a whole lot of time on Jung. But one of the most important contributions that Jung made to personality theory is the recognition of introversion and extroversion. On a fun storytelling side note, Jung was a very shy person. He was incredibly introverted. And he's also a really weird kid. Like if you ever read some of his recollections of when he was 4, it's like, oh, Jung, you were just so weird. You were such a weird little boy. Anyways, Jung was very introverted, and he wanted to know why he was so different from his colleagues. And so he developed a theory of introversion and extroversion. And this particular theory is very central to a lot of trait measures of personality. It's very important. I would say it's his most important contribution to personality theory today. The Myers-Briggs is a set of measures based on Jungian theory that includes a measure of introversion and extroversion, and it also includes some other components that the developers of the test thought aligned with various forms of Jungian theory about the structure of personality, including sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, and judgment and perception. So if you ever see someone online saying, oh, I'm an INFJ, that would be someone who's introverted, intuitive, feeling, and judging. The problem with the Myers-Briggs, although it's interesting, is that it's not super reliable, and it doesn't predict behavior very well. So it doesn't have a lot of validity to it. Another challenge is that whereas introversion and extroversion are on a very recognizable continuum, the rest of them are a little bit of an artificial continuum. Thinking and feeling aren't necessarily on the same scale. The way I think about them is that they're two different scales, and you could be high on both or low on both. Just because you're high on one doesn't automatically mean you're low on another. I got into an argument with a Jungian once, as you do, and one of the things he said was, well, would you rather build something with your hands or read a book? And I said, both. I love my power tools, and one day I want to use them to build bookshelves for all the books that I love to read. You can have both. It's not either or. So there can be some challenges with measurement validity and with reliability. And as a result, it's not used a lot in personality research. If you do searches for it on databases, people just don't tend to use it when they're studying how personality predicts behavior. It's not widely used in academia, even though it is used very often in the real world as a fun thing that might help people learn a little bit more about themselves. Here's some other personality measures that I also have opinions about. The Eysenck Personality Inventory was first developed by Eysenck that included extroversion and introversion. Once again, a key personality component that is valuable, is on indeed a continuum, and is fairly important when understanding someone's personality. And Eysenck also developed an additional measure of neuroticism and stability. It's interesting to note that this personality inventory that Eysenck developed was a callback to the four humors model that I talked about in that earlier video. Oh, Sansa has opinions about that. Oh yes, I just picked her up to put on my lap, and she had an opinion about that too. But these different combinations, extroversion plus neuroticism, would lead to someone who was choleric. Extroversion plus stability would lead to someone who was sanguine. Someone who's introverted and neurotic would be someone who's melancholic, and someone who is introverted and stable would be someone who is phlegmatic. And the problem with the four humors model is that when you start with a theory, this is the same problem with the Myers-Briggs. When you start with a theory that you think describes everything, we often tend to focus on making it pretty, making it symmetrical, and as a result, we can sometimes not necessarily pay attention to what's in front of us, but what we would like to see. And so sometimes our theories can be lacking. So when we have theory-based approaches to measuring personality, sometimes we fall short. Cattell was one of the first to try to attempt a data-driven approach to measuring personality. He developed what he called the 16 PF, or 16 personality factors approach. He used the lexical approach, which meant that he started from a dictionary and found all the words that we use to describe traits, and then gave a series of measures to people to see how those traits would cluster in a process known as factor analysis. So basically, he was exploring how all the different traits correlated with one another to see if there were any overarching factors. When Cattell was developing this, factor analysis was in its very early stages, and he couldn't necessarily perform an overarching factor analysis. He had to do it a little piecemeal. So it was a little flawed in his initial approach, and he ended up discovering 16 independent factors that each were on a continuum. People still use Cattell today. One of the problems I have with Cattell is that it's just a little bit too complicated in terms of its interpretation. And once again, his statistical tests were a little outdated in the way that he was using them. And we've since come up with a more effective way of analyzing that very same data, which I will get to with the Big Five. This is my favorite. Of course, once again, I come at it from a perspective that is shaped by my education and training, but this is, according to my opinion, the best holistic measure of personality traits. It also used the lexical approach, so coming up with words that we use to describe ourselves and other people in trait form, and then discovering how they clustered together using factor analysis to see how they all correlated and clumped. And what they discovered using this approach in a way that has been replicated a few different times was 5 different factors. We can think of these factors as each being on a continuum. So that argument that I had before with the Myers-Briggs, where thinking and feeling were not on a continuum, doesn't apply here. You can be either high or low in any of these things. And each of them are considered to be relatively independent from one another. So just because you're high in extroversion doesn't mean you're high in conscientiousness. They're considered to be separate. And when I say they're on a continuum, you can also think of them as being roughly normally distributed, so that most people fall in the middle and that you have some people that are on the extremes. So here are the 5 factors. Openness is also considered just openness to new experiences, intellectual curiosity, approach to novel things. Someone who's high in conscientiousness tends to very much want to follow the rules and enjoys structure, and once again has that sense of organization to their lives. Whereas someone who's low in conscientiousness is a little bit looser with the rules, doesn't necessarily, they don't matter as much to them, they're not as organized and neat. Extroversion is how we interact with other people. and it's kind of where we gain our energy from. Once again, a classic definition of extroversion is someone who's very outgoing and sociable, and someone who's introverted, who is low in extroversion, would be somebody who is less sociable and less seeking of other people. There have been a lot of memes lately about people discovering how introverted they are as a result of being isolated. My friend Tim just posted on Facebook, for example, it turns out I'm a lot less introverted than I thought. He's really not doing as well with isolation as he thought he'd be. Agreeableness is how friendly we are. So once again, this is independent from extroversion. Someone can be high in agreeableness, but low in extroversion, and vice versa. So it's our degree of friendliness, how much we want to please other people. Neuroticism, this is a word that's often misunderstood. Neuroticism is actually our tendency to have unstable emotions, and our tendency to also feel strong negative emotions, like sadness. And people who are low in neuroticism are people who are considered to be calm, whereas people who are high in neuroticism are considered to have much stormier, fluctuating emotions, and once again are much more likely to feel strong negative emotions. People often confuse neuroticism and psychosis. It's very different. Very briefly, in our remaining minutes on this video, I wanted to talk about heritability and the big five. So it turns out that each of the factors have a heritability factor of between 40 and 60%, meaning that around half of our score on something like extroversion is determined by our genetics, and the other half is due to our environment. So this is a really great illustration of nature through nurture, how we are a product of both our genetic heritage and the environment to which we are exposed. I would say that what this also shows is that a significant portion of our personality can be due to our genetics. And in equal measure, a significant portion can be due to our environment. So a big chunk of each. I talk a lot more about personality and health when I talk in my health psychology class. This is one of the areas where I was trained. One of the personality psychologists I studied with, Suzanne Segerstrom, does a lot of work on optimism and health outcomes. But for example, conscientiousness is one of the biggest predictors of longevity. I think I did talk a little bit about that in class before we broke for spring break. But that's one of the strongest predictors of longevity, because people who are conscientious tend to be a lot more likely to wash their hands for all 20 seconds and take all of the antibiotics in the bottle and show up to their physical therapy and their mammogram and their prostate exam and wear their seatbelts. And once again, other traits tend to be linked to health, including optimism. One of the big ones we talk about in health psychology is type A personality, which is a need for control and to be in charge, and how when that is combined with hostility, it can really substantially negatively impact heart health. So people who have control issues and who get angry when that control is taken away from them can really be at a far higher risk for getting heart attack and having chronic heart failure and things like that. And that was specifically a scale developed to explore heart health in terms of type A versus type B, which you can look up more information about online.